I've asked Dr. Phillips to come and talk, and this is something that specifically the ag retailers probably have as much or more interest in, is the discussion that's going on in our field right now in terms of what is an essential nutrient and what is a beneficial nutrient. What does that mean in the classifications? And when I say that, think about, as Dr. Phillips is talking, think about how we regulate fertilizers as essential nutrients or soil additives as beneficials. And so that is, in legislative terms and regulation terms, a big key of what's going on here. So with that, Dr. Phillips.
Thank you, Brian. How's this microphone? No, sound good in the back? You can hear me clearly? All right. Yeah, as Brian mentioned, this topic was one that was born out of a conversation that Josh Maples brought Brian and I in on back early in the fall. Beneficial, essential nutrients. I had a lot of plant physiology in here to explain how all this works, but then I noticed when Radon came with a lot more physiology than I thought he was going to bring, no questions at all. So I'm kind of glad I took that out, and I'm going to focus more just on the context of the conversation, just some of my observations, reading through all these email chains and getting caught up to speed on these discussions that are happening at the fertilizer policy level. Brian mentioned retailers will have an interest in this. How many retailers? Could you show me where the retailers are? Okay, what about farmers, producers, users of these products? Okay, because it's really both of you should be aware of these conversations and the potential implications they'll have on some decisions that you make. I mentioned, am I turned on here? All right. Josh Maples is our fertilizer program administrator at ODEF, and he sits on a committee that's part of a large organization known as APCO. All of the United States, Canada, and Puerto Rico have their own fertilizer regulatory agencies, but they all work together within this APCO organization. And the primary purpose is just to achieve some uniformity in fertilizer regulations from state to state in the U.S. And they discuss things such as uniform legislations regarding definitions, rulings, enforcement practices, encourage the adoption of scientifically validated sampling and testing methodologies for fertilizer and fertilizer products, high standards of inspection and enforcement, adequate labeling, safe use of fertilizer, facilities for exchange of information, and making sure that we're using fertilizers in a safe and effective way with regard to environmental protection. And so we're lucky to have Josh on this committee because we have access to a lot of this background conversation that's going on regarding potential policy changes. And so here in Oklahoma, we have the benefit of being a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of seeing what's coming and what's being discussed. And one of the big discussions that's happened right now is regarding this uniform definition of certain terminologies. And that's what we're going to spend most of the time today talking about, is the definitions of essential and beneficial nutrients. What are the differences? Well, since 1939, we've had a definition of what an essential nutrient is. This was published, basically. There were several that worked on this concept in the 20s and 30s, but it was published by Daniel Arnon. He was a professor at UC Berkeley, and he had been working on plant nutrition for several years, and he published what we refer to in soil fertility as the criteria of essentiality. The primary concept is that the nutrient must be essential for completion of the life cycle of the plant. This is going all the way to seed. There are a lot of nutrients that a plant can grow in the absence of certain nutrients. It can produce leaves and stems, but it won't go to seed. And so that would make that nutrient essential. There are others that enhance plant growth in terms of leaves and stem production, but don't have anything to do with seed. If you take it away, that plant will still go to seed. And so that nutrient would not be considered essential. The second is that the function of an essential nutrient cannot be replaced by any other nutrient. For example, take nitrogen's role in amino acid and protein synthesis. We can't put potassium in there in the place of nitrogen. It's got to be nitrogen in that role. And then finally, an essential nutrient must be directly involved in plant metabolism, either formation of an enzyme, a role in a biochemical pathway, a structural component of plant cells. We've got to be able to clearly define what that nutrient is doing in the plant. We can't just say, well, there's a benefit to it. I know it looks better, it does better, but we don't know exactly what it's doing or where it's acting in the plant. To determine it to be essential, we have to be able to document that. And so we come up with this list of 17 essential nutrients, and these have been the same for centuries, some of them. In the 1800s, we knew about, the non-mineral ones from water and air, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, the macronutrients that we tend to divide between primary and secondary. And we see this designation kind of going away. That's one of the scientific debates, is primary and secondary has a connotation of some being less important than others. And so now we're starting to teach more just the macro and micro based on the quantity required by the plant. Macronutrients are usually discussed in terms of percentages, while these micronutrients are discussed in terms of parts per million or milligrams per kilogram. Most all of these were determined to be essential in the 19th century. Iron also was in the 1800s. The rest of these came in the 1920s and 30s. In fact, Arnon worked with a lot of the micros in terms of determining their essentiality through his experiments out at UC Berkeley. Chlorine didn't come on till about the 50s, and the newest is nickel. We didn't identify nickel as essential until 1983. We knew it was essential. We knew the plant couldn't live without it, but we didn't know exactly what it was doing. And then in the 80s, we determined that it was functioning with the urease enzyme. And so nickel then was the most recently added essential nutrient. Essential nutrients are manageable for us due to several other of our basic principles of soil fertility. One is the law of the minimum that von Liebig, who also was very instrumental in identifying the essentiality of a lot of the macronutrients in the 19th century, was that the yield of a plant is directly proportional to the most limiting growth factor, even if several others are limiting to a lesser degree. And you've seen this illustration a lot, probably. At several of these schools and trainings, we talk about this barrel with the different size staves, and whichever one is the most limiting is the one that's going to control yield. And that's a key of essentiality, is that it's directly related to availability and yield and deficiency and our ability to treat these deficiencies. We understand essential nutrients in a way that allows us to test for them, make a determination on the sufficiency of them, and then make a fertilizer application to make up for any deficiencies that may exist. Now, changing gears, beneficial plant nutrients are not essential. They don't meet the criteria for essentiality, but in certain instances, under certain conditions, they can improve plant growth and or quality. They can increase resistance to pests, diseases, and other abiotic stresses, drought, salinity, etc. But they are not required to complete the life cycle. All of the benefits may be realized, but if we take that nutrient away, the plant will still survive and produce without it. It may not be as healthy or as vigorous, but it will complete its life cycle. And the list of these includes several: sodium, cobalt, silicon, selenium, aluminum, iodine, vanadium, titanium. Some more widely recognized as beneficial, some beneficial to a wider variety of crops. Some are fairly specific in what we've seen. None of these have been listed as essential, even though, and this is one of the debates that people who work with these, particularly that spend their whole career working on silicon, for example, really believe it to be essential, but it doesn't meet the criteria of essentiality at this point. But I'm going to show you there are certain instances, and you can kind of understand how we begin to get a bit of a gray area with some of these in terms of, is it essential for plant growth or is it just a beneficial product? Sodium is one. Sodium actually has been regulated since 1965, like an essential element, but it's not an essential element. The beneficial effects are enhanced osmotic regulation during water stress, improved growth in halophytes. The definition of that word is salt-loving. We've got these species in Oklahoma, particularly in western Oklahoma. We call it salt grass or salt bush or something. So you'll find these growing in saline soils or high salt environments. There are some reported essential functions of sodium, particularly in C4 and CAM plants. CAM plants are succulents, cactus, things like that. C4s are typically your warm season plants. In Oklahoma, it'd be most all of our warm season forages: corn, sorghum, millet. All of these have a C4 metabolism. It's a different photosynthetic pathway than a C3 plant, like wheat or some of the winter annuals, soybeans, for example. And so sodium's directly involved in this molecule here, this PEP molecule. And without sodium, when we take that away, some of the C4 plants have trouble completing these metabolic processes. And so that fits the definition of essentiality in terms of being able to complete the life cycle. But potassium can fix this a lot of, particularly with the drought tolerance, potassium can replace. And so the functionality of sodium in terms of an essentiality is really restricted to a certain group of plants. And so we've never classified it as essential, but there would be several arguments made for the case of C4 plants. And that's why we find it being grouped into a regulated nutrient, even though we've never redefined it as essential. Here's some data. This is from the mid-'80s, but this is basically the same type of data that they found in the 60s, where I've got a C4 plant here on the left side of the screen and a C3 plant on the right. You can see as we decrease the CO2 concentration, which affects photosynthetic rate, you can see the addition of sodium significantly increases growth in the plant material. And so the data are there. It's just never gotten to the point that we've changed the definition of it. Cobalt is another one that is regulated. It's been regulated since 2007, so it's a fairly new addition to the list of regulated, but it still has not been, it's still considered a beneficial plant. It's used primarily by legumes to form the nitrogenase enzyme. Legumes can form this, the nodules can have this enzyme without the presence of cobalt, but we do have enough data and there's enough literature to suggest that this process is in fact enhanced by cobalt. In fact, we've got these cobalt products in the market in Oklahoma. I was talking to a dealer just yesterday, as a matter of fact, who said they're selling a bunch for peanuts kind of over in western Oklahoma. And so these products are out there, and there is data to support this. This is one that happens to be regulated by ODAF. So, these products should be registered when these cobalt products come in for use on legume crops in Oklahoma. They should be registered through ODAF. Here's some data showing the type of response we see to the addition of cobalt. This is in a lupin crop. You can see pretty significant increases in terms of nodule weight, cobalt concentration in the nodule, number of bacteroids per nodule, and then other molecules increased in production. Cobalt also modulates ethylene production. Ethylene is a ripening hormone in plants. It causes senescence, fruit ripening, etc. And so cobalt tends to modulate this, allows the plants to stay green a little longer, helps under stress. A lot of times plants will begin to mature more rapidly when they sense stress. This will keep them greener through that stress period to finish up the fruit production a little more. And also antioxidant enzyme activation. This again is also an increased stress mechanism, stress resistance mechanism in terms of drought or saline situations. Silicon is another one. Silicon is one that is not currently regulated, but if I was to guess what would be the next nutrient that gets regulated, it would probably be silicon based on the volume of work that's being done with it. Silicon has been shown, the beneficial effects is that it enhances plant structural integrity, stress resistance. Several studies, especially in rice, there's a good bit of work on rice coming out of LSU. The way silicon works is actually just like you would take a silicon caulk, for example, around a window and create this barrier of penetration. The same thing happens in plants in the intracellular spaces. And so the silicon creates these barriers, basically, which prevents water loss in drought stress. It prevents infiltration from insects and disease. And so that's the function that it's doing. As I mentioned, this work in rice, I was doing a gig down at LSU probably in 7 or 8, and there was a scientist down there, a breeder, doing a lot of work with silicon, and he was convinced they had to have silicon. The rice extension specialist at the time was kind of poo-pooing the whole thing. He was a soil fertility guy, said, nah, silicon's not doing anything. But over the years, they had enough data where he became a believer. Him and the soil fertility specialists down there have, in fact, Brenda Tubanya, an OSU grad who's the soil fertility specialist down at LSU now, published a very comprehensive review of the role of silicon in plants. And even though it now still exists as beneficial, you can see some of the benefits here. In these rice crops, here's a disease resistance, here's insect resistance. Here's this was I can't remember exactly. This had something to do with the drought or drying out. And then here's just a general look at the rice head. So there's data out there. We just haven't got to the point where we've begun to think about changing the definition of silicon. Selenium and aluminum are also recognized in what we consider to be the preeminent text on essential and beneficial nutrients. We're not close, I don't think, to changing the designation of either one of these. In fact, we are more concerned with toxicity problems with both of these nutrients than we are any benefit. Selenium helps with oxidative stress, but this is primarily in animals and humans. That this glutathione peroxidase enzyme, it exists to some degree in plants, but most of the time it's not selenium, it's sulfur. The selenium and sulfur uptake and translocation mechanisms are exactly the same. And so in the case of plants, most of the time this enzyme is made up of sulfur instead of selenium, but we can significantly increase tissue concentration of selenium with selenium fertilizer. And in terms of the human health aspect, we see a lot of the work with selenium being in the biofortification and trying to increase the selenium content of grain, for example. Not so much in the US. This is more international issues where we have more nutritional disorders, more food insecurity. And so we see selenium being looked at in that regard. Aluminum most of our issues here in Oklahoma, aluminum's a problem for us in low pH in terms of aluminum toxicity. But aluminum tea is one where we actually do see some increased vegetative growth in tea with increased aluminum. And then aluminum also contributes to the blue color in hydrangeas in terms of ornamentals. I'd always been taught that it's low pH that makes the hydrangeas turn blue. So you want to put some elemental sulfur or something in your flower beds, drive the pH down. Well, what you're doing is increasing aluminum solubility. It's actually the aluminum that makes the hydrangeas blue, not the low pH. And so, again, I don't think we're close here. I think these are probably still going to kind of stay where they are for now. Silicon's probably the next one we're going to see. But in terms of the debates that are going on about this essentiality versus beneficiality, it goes back to the APCO definition of fertilizer, which just says fertilizer is a substance containing one or more recognized plant nutrient. The definition doesn't say that these are essential nutrients, it's just they're a recognized plant nutrient. And so now you've got these people, scientists and policymakers and lobbyists, they're saying, okay, well, there are a lot of reasons why I might want these products to be fertilizer, and they have nutrients in them. So, well, where do we draw the line? So it comes down to, well, what is a nutrient? And this is one of the conversations that's going on in this committee that Josh is on. It's like, well, what is a nutrient? Is it an element? Is it the actual compound or molecule that the plants take up? And it just goes back and forth. And it's interesting. I've sat on some policy boards before, and it just boggles my mind, the haggling that will go on over a word. You know, and it comes down to semantics, but every single little word in legislation is dissected at length, ad nauseum. And so you get to some of these things that we take for granted. Well, it's a nutrient. The plant, it's food, it's nutrition for the plant. Policy, I mean, you could tell them, Josh, it is not that simple ever. Another one is there are beneficial substances as fertilizers. Again, it goes back, well, a fertilizer is just nutrients. Okay, well, if the plant takes it up, then it must be fertilizer. Selenium a fertilizer? Can we put out aluminum fertilizer? Again, it goes down to how we define these words in science and then in policy. And then the one that's probably getting the most argument, I guess, or debate rather, is moving these nutrients from beneficial into the list of secondary nutrients. But because in APCO, they have these two tables. They have the macronutrients and primary nutrients, and then secondary and micronutrients. And cobalt and sodium show up in that second list. And so all the silicon lovers now, they want to get silicon into that list. And so, you know, the precedent is there. They're never defined as essential, but they do make the list of a micronutrient based on the quantity that would be taken up by the plant. And so these are discussions that are going on. And so where this committee has landed is that we need some science-based go-to on this. What are we going to use as the rule book, basically? And they've decided that it's going to be this text that we actually used. This is the 4th edition, 2024 publication. We used to teach out of this book over in the botany department. We used to have a class called Mineral Nutrition of Higher Plants. If any of you went through soil fertility here at OSU, don't teach that class anymore, but Brian and I are working on a curriculum to bring that back into the Department of Plant and Soil Sciences. So we're going to start teaching out of this book probably in spring of 26. But these guys that wrote this, they're top shelf plant nutritionists, soil fertility and plant nutrition guys. Most of them are plant physiologists, but this is viewed as the Bible, if you will, of plant nutrition. And so we're going to refer to the listing of essential and beneficial nutrients as they appear in this book. In terms of some of the other definitions, plant nutrient. What's new is that it used to just say it's an element necessary for plant growth. And we'll say now it's essential or beneficial for plant growth, because this was one of the things that the beneficial crowd is saying, well, we're not getting the same love that the essential crowd is getting because this is a plant nutrient. Plants are responding. They're doing good. I'm improving performance. Okay, it's a plant nutrient. Essential, beneficial, they're all plant nutrients. But essential, we're going to stick with Arnon's criteria of essentiality. We're not changing that. 1939 to 2024, it is what it is. If it doesn't meet the criteria, then it's a beneficial. And if it's beneficial, absolutely, it can be shown to benefit plant growth or development and quality attributes, but doesn't meet the criteria of essentiality. And another argument was, well, if we go with the list, how do we add it to it? Well, you just say, we're going to add to the list. As we update the next edition of the Marshner text, we'll add to the list, if so be it, if the data is there. This is all science. It's got to be science-based, even at the policy. And this is one of the things that I'm very happy about in Oklahoma is that we have a scientist leading our fertilizer policy program. A lot of states don't have that benefit. They've got politicians in those positions that don't know nearly what Josh knows about fertilizer. And so as long as we stay science-based with policy, I think we'll all be protected both on the commercial side and the consumer side. Moving on a little bit to specifics regarding Oklahoma, our fertilizer policy pretty much follows APCO, almost word for word. But what we have in Oklahoma that a lot of states don't have is another category of regulated products called soil amendments. This is where you'd find all your humic and fulvic acids. It also indicates that these are natural or synthetic substances applied to plants. So a lot of the biostimulants, the biofertilizers, the specialty fertilizers, things that don't technically meet the definition of fertilizer are called sometimes fertilizers. They all fall under these soil amendments. And a lot of our beneficial products or products that contain different microblends that include beneficials will fall under this category. And as I mentioned, some states don't have this, so that's why they're fighting for, call it fertilizer. And the argument was, well, you need this category as well. Because the big difference between fertilizers and some of these amendment products is the guaranteed analysis. You don't have to guarantee any analysis on a soil amendment, but if you're going to call it a fertilizer, you've got to have amendments. And you see, we actually, as I mentioned, we regulate. We have a guaranteed analysis minimum for cobalt and sodium, even though they're not essential within our fertilizer program, policy program, we do still regulate these two nutrients. So I got to thinking, a lot of debate on whether it should be a fertilizer or not. And so Josh and I were talking like, what would be some benefits to some of these products being called fertilizer? And I like the way Josh said it. He said, well, there's an enhanced consumer palatability. If I'm a grower and I have a salesman on my farm offering me, plant health promoting products or soil amendments, or if he's offering me a fertilizer, in my mind, that seems to have more credibility. It just rings a bit more validity, I think, if it's called a fertilizer. So this would be a potential benefit. There would be standardization and quality control of these products. Again, they'd fall under the same requirements for labeling and guarantee that fertilizers would. There would be probably a more clear recognition of agronomic benefit, because to label these, we have to be very sure what they're doing and that they're doing what we think they're doing. Because a lot of the current products that are on the market, when you go to test them and chemically analyze them, they're not what they say they are. And they don't do what they say they do. And this is just a fact. This is how these things get into the market. You know, we probably do as good a job as anybody of keeping an eye on this. Brian's got probably one of the most comprehensive product testing protocols, certainly in the central and southern plains, but probably in the US, in terms of what exactly do I have here. Brian won't just put it out, won't just have the industry come out. He's got to have the product in his hands. He understands the physical properties of it, how it's going to go out, what it's going to do, an in-depth chemical analysis of the product itself, of the plant tissue. And so we're in pretty good shape with this, but if they were more heavily regulated, we'd understand them even better. Market growth, the more products that add value to production, the better off everybody is. Whether you're moving these products or you're using these products, the more scientifically validated, registered, certified products we can get, the more options we have. And that's a benefit. And then research opportunities. Just like Brian's doing, you know, once we understand more and these are labeled more clearly, we can begin to work with them more to really figure out how to put them within the context of 4Rs, for example, some of these products. On the flip side, there are benefits to this, but there's also a lot of reasons why we don't want to see a lot of these being labeled as fertilizers. One is the lack of knowledge about crop requirements and soil testing. If it's a fertilizer, then we've got to make a recommendation for it, which means we've got to test the soil for it. And so we've got to do all that work. And so just like research opportunities is a pro, the research needs is going to be a setback. It's going to take us a while to figure out what is the right extraction and the right analytical method. Now we've got to calibrate for a recommendation system. LSU's done this with silicon, and it took probably 10 years for Brenda to come up with her recs in terms of understanding soil test numbers, the correlation and calibration work that needs to be done. It was 10 years and a lot of money. And so, you know, that's one expense. There's also going to be a cost with registering these products, all the regulatory work and the registration. We heard about the herbicide costs the other day. Fertilizer products follow the same path basically for registration. This will increase product costs, which again, now we've got to have maybe the ROI now makes sense for you. Maybe it pencils out for these the cobalt products on peanuts, for example. If farmers are buying it, they must see it paying for itself. But now we add in all this other stuff to get it registered and get it as a cobalt fertilizer. Now that cost is going to go up. Finally, there's risks. You know, if there's access to something and it becomes more freely used and it's a fertilizer, I'm going to put it out. Then, you know, we get into potential unknown environmental risks. We get competition with other nutrients in the soil, uptake challenges within the plant. So again, this kind of plays into the unclear effectiveness. So wrapping up, what does all this mean? Why did we talk about this today? Well, it's because there's multiple agendas out there. Depending on the group involved with this, there's different motivations to do things with these products, whether they be beneficial or essential. And you need to be aware of that, whether you're a dealer of products coming from a wholesaler or you're a consumer of these products or you're considering it. Consider the fact that the people who want to see things happen with this have their own agendas. There's a difference between fertilizers and soil amendments. They call it a specialty fertilizer, but it might not be regulated in the same way as a fertilizer by definition will be. And so work through your county or area educators, extension specialists, your crop consultants, understand what you've got. Basically, do your homework with these products. There are documented benefits to some of these products, and there's debate going on about what we call them, how they work, but the take-home message is do your homework. We're in good shape. We've got a good group of policymakers and scientists and extension educators here in the state. So take advantage of those resources and do your homework. Make a well-informed decision regarding these products. And with that, that'll finish that up, Brian. Josh, you want to add something? Good. I hope you do.
Oh, that was unclear.
Good. I hope you do. I was hoping Josh would still be here.
I'm not picking. So one thing I just wanted to mention. So in Oklahoma, we do regulate soil amendments. We do register those products. And that includes silicon and other things, humic acids, all the things. But the big push was 46 states plus Canada plus Puerto Rico register fertilizer. 34, including Canada and Puerto Rico, register soil amendments. So there is a gap, and there is not as broad of a standard. There is a standard here in the state. We do try to register those, look at data. But the big thing, and I think what me and Dr. Phillips discussed was essentially with fertilizers, there is a deficiency, typically recommendation. There's a deficiency, see a need, fill a need. With soil amendments, a lot of the times it comes down to it could help in certain instances, in certain cases. So that's why I reiterate that last, do your homework. With fertilizers, always follow the recommendations, always try to give good recommendations based on soil test, need, potential yield. But again, with some soil amendments, just do your homework. Try to make the best decision for you and for your customer.
You said there's a lot of definitions. One that kind of caught me would be what would quantify or qualify as an agronomic benefit. Is it just yield, or is there different things that, how would you quantify an agronomic benefit?
Well, it's yield and quality, resistance to the different stresses. That's a big one we see. In fact, Brian had a silicon product in a cotton trial down at Fort Cobb this past year. And we could pick those plots out just as clear as day. They were a more vigorous, greener, little taller plant. Didn't amount to anything in yield, in terms of lint yield. But because there may have been an enhanced structural composition of that plant, had we encountered some stress, those might have been a bit more resilient. So I'd consider that to be an agronomic benefit of a beneficial product. In fact, the data I've seen, that's probably the biggest one that I see in terms of some of the beneficial nutrients. Other things that I've seen over the years regarding some biostimulants, for example, is that most of them that I have studied and worked with don't do what they say they'll do in terms of replacing nutrient inputs or improving efficiency. What they do is when you put them into a well-fertilized program, then you can enhance some of the metabolic pathways and get maybe a little more vigorous or a little more early season growth, which again makes them more resilient. But again, that goes down to the labeling issue. But certainly the enhancement of a well-managed program would be a benefit, and then the increased stress resistance, I think, more so than yield.
Yeah.
I guess coming from like a county extension agent making a soil recommendation, I mean, usually we make, tons of lime, pounds of urea, DAP, potash, or whatever. Is that going to change? Are these going to be more like the secondary micronutrients, or is this something we as county agents need to worry about for very long? I mean, is it something that's going to, just what am I supposed to be doing?
Yeah. Most of these products will have guidelines. I mean, they have a label and use recommendations. They're I don't know how much regulation you do on that in terms of the application, but they'll say, you know, so many quarts to the acre or whatever. What you got to be careful with on that in terms of, you know, the homework part is a lot of these, if you look at the percentages of nutrient that's in them, sometimes it's not enough to even do anything, even if you did have a problem. I worked with a product years ago that it was for potatoes. It's primarily a potassium product, but it had some zinc and other micros in it. And I got to looking at it, and turns out the amount of zinc that was actually in that product, if we needed zinc, it wasn't gonna do anything. You know, so that you have to understand, and this is one of the things that Brian is finding, is that some of these products don't have in them what they say they have in them. And so it's tricky.
Basic with, you know, whatever. What it needs is that going to be not really tied to the soil test, because it's probably going to be the farmer bringing in this product and saying, hey, what do you think about this? How am I going to call it snake oil or something that, because I mean, like a lot of lime products we have today, like you say, they don't have enough complement there to change anything.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a lot of homework, I guess.
That's basically how Brian's treatment structure goes from 15 to 20 to 35 to 50 every year. It starts with that question: does this work? Brian says, I don't know. Give me some, let me see. You know, and that's really, in the case of these products, that's all we can do is.
And from the regulatory perspective, so like with pesticide has the umbrella of EPA. So for fertilizers, for these soil amendments for ag lime, we don't have that overarching federal umbrella. We rely on the state by state basis. And so that's why fertilizer, typically most states, arm in arm, sing the kumbaya, we're all in alignment. But it's with the soil amendments, it's with the potential addition of these beneficial nutrients that it is different. I will say, if you do have questions, we could give you my information. You can contact the office. Soil amendments have to be registered. We have to have at least data from Oklahoma, has to be from similar cropping system, similar environment, has to show some statistical support for efficacy for these products. Not all are registered. So we have in Oklahoma 10,000 fertilizer products registered. This past year, we've only had a total of 1,000 soil amendments. So there is the gap, but also the soil amendment thing, it could be silicon, which will help with abiotic stress and drought and with alkaline and with acidic situations. Or it could be humic acids if you have low organic matter, things like that. But I think the big thing is just this is coming further down the pipeline, and it's primarily going to affect mostly those potential nutrient categories, which would be the selenium, the titanium, the iodine, the silicon especially. And so that's why it's just putting on your radar. It's kind of harder to give a silicon recommendation when your soil is loaded with it.
I'll add my recommendation to the educators. Call me. I'll sniff test it. I'll tell you whether I've run it, and I'll give you a theoretical background of where, why, and how it should work based upon the science and based upon literature. I've got a 3-ring binder handed to me that was Dr. Billy Tucker's 3-ring binder. And so how many of you knew who Dr. Billy Tucker was? That was his 3-ring that was handed down from Tucker to Johnson to myself, and is a 3-inch binder, and Tucker retired in
70.
Yeah. And I could trace a lot of those product actives. And if I looked at who was selling them in 75, it was the same product that just changed names 15 times. So, yeah, Jimmy.
As a producer, I'll just say it's whole life.
And when I find the magic bullet, I'll tell everybody. I'll be a freaking millionaire. All right. Thank you. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
One more.
Actually,
Yeah, that's a good question, but in terms of silica in the soil, there's a lot there already. And you look at these application rates down there, it's like 6 tons of silica that they recommend to put out on a deficient soil. And so I don't know that it may exist, and I just didn't get that far in studying what they've done in LSU for this talk. But they'll get to a point where they'll understand, where that target tissue concentration would be. And that's where they'll get into the toxicity. In the soil, I don't know that you'd ever get so much silica that you say this is a toxic growing environment, but certainly the uptake, I don't know that it would based on what it's doing in the plant, but you could get into other metabolic problems, I would guess. But at some point you'd define a critical range above which would be toxic, below which would be deficient. 20 tons? Yeah.
all right. Thank you, Dr. Phillips.
All right.
You get me again because Lofton's like, I don't want to follow Phillips. So I get, huh? You don't want, yeah, thanks. All right. So, and here's a comment in one of the challenges. So Dr. Phillips talked about the silica product that showed this nice green up of vigor down at Fort Cobb. So Fort Cobb, deep sandy soil, a lot of clean water. Well, guess what? It's not a pure silica product, right? It's got silica and boron, and boron might have had me a nice green flash too. So was it the boron or was it the silica? Or, I mean, we didn't get any yield. It was still 4 3/4 bales. So it's not like it was yield limited environment. It was poor yield for Fort Cobb, but so that's one of the challenges that you bring a product to me or you get brought a product. It's not just pure silica. It's silica and zinc and iron and manganese and boron and copper, and they're all at 0.0000007%. And so that's one of the challenges. All right, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time, if this could be as much Q&A, if you guys have questions for me as far as fertility goes. I want to go over the TAPS project that Josh mentioned yesterday. This is a fun project that we're trying to get bigger. We're going through the first 2 years. It's a little bit of a learning curve on getting it done right. They've done it out in the high plains. So started with Jason Warren on the corn taps. They did that for about 5 or 6 years. Some of you participated. Gone through cotton taps and sorghum taps. And Josh had best effort at the sorghum taps or soybean taps. But it was quite a failure because it was so wet. And then it was not. But, we do this, and the TAPS project is that we want to do things that pit you against each other, right? It's a competitive process. We have a set of standard treatments in these different crops, and then we give the competitors different options on what to choose. And so when we look at wheat, we're looking at a specific 4-base treatment. So we're comparing some nitrogen timing as base. We're comparing variety. We're looking at populations, all these things. So we come in, we pick a couple, and some of you in here, we ask you, given this planting date, and that's kind of had to shift, right? Because I was going to say, let's plant October 10th. Drill couldn't get in the ground. So we waited, but given this planting date, what is your variety? What is your population? And what is your seed treat? Okay. So you get that choice. Cultivar, population, seed treat, and pre-plant. I'm giving you a soil sample result. We can't do in-furrow yet. We're getting there. Next year we'll have in-furrow. This year we're working through the processes of these drills. But pre-plant fertility. The cool thing is that you have a 5-foot by 20-foot plot that's replicated 4 times, but right next to it, we're doing everything that you say to agronomically do to your variety on one standard variety. Meaning last year we used Showdown as a check. So no matter what you chose, it could have been atomic, it could have been anything, whatever you did to that atomic, we did the exact same population, the exact same fungicide, the exact same fertilizer to Showdown. This lets us look at your overall selection based upon how much is variety driving the yield in the end and just your management. So we can compare your overall farming versus just your management against on one variety. Does that make sense? So we get to kind of play around in a couple different venues and see who's doing what. And so choices, variety, population, seed treatment, fertility, and fungicide. Once we get going through the season, during this time of year in early spring, I'm not sending out lots of notes, but as soon as we start getting close to green up, I start asking, do you want fertility? Do you want fungicide? And this is almost a weekly or every other week. I'm giving notes like, this is where we're at. Here's pictures of your plots. Here's what we're seeing. What fungicide, if any, do you want? Do you want fertility? What source? What rate? Let me know by this week and we go out and fertilize. And so that happened up through anthesis. There was options to do anything of fertility and fungicide through anthesis. We managed herbicide and we managed pesticide. Not the pesticide. We managed the insects and that stuff. We just left the fungicides and fertilizers the options. Teams management tested against that single variety of Showdown. And in the end, we're looking for certain things. We want to know, A, who got the most yield. We, of course, want to know who made the most money. I think that's actually the first priority, right? Who makes the most money? And then the follow-up is who baked the best loaf of bread. So we sent all this data up. We had Winfield has a lab, and they allowed us to do, it wasn't baking, it was milling. Who could mill the best flour, and sent that up, and they did mill analysis, and we looked into that. So what we had for the 23-24 crop, we had the West, the East teams, we had the wheat improvement team. So Dr. Silva, myself, and Dr. Carver at that time. Now we're bringing on more. So we'll be bringing on all the other specialists to look in and participate and just be a function of this as we move on. The Wheat Commission, the wheat growers, had a couple of producers, Kissling and Rendell Farms. Think, that really kind of stretches. They're two very different people. If you know them, Keith and Brent are not the same. And so got those two kind of operations. And then just because we had to have Romulo Lotto send us his recommendations because we really wanted to beat purple, Tom. All right. So our base management. So there were 4 treatments that we just wanted to look at, and this is our base management. Nitrogen, we had either really delayed in because some of the folks were using the green seeker style approach. So we had a really late in, and then we had all up front. And so, and when I say late, it was late. So no nitrogen until post joining at 120 pounds. Then we did a 75 pre-45 green up shot for the full in, what we'd say a fully fertilized population. We did 2 populations on our checks of 1.25 mil and 0.87 million. We did no fungicide versus a 2-shot fungicide with the generic at joint. And then we used the Prosaros, Flagellus, the Cadillac. I had a jug of Prosaros, so it just worked out well. It's just what it was. So generic TEB, and then that's our, so we're comparing, we get to look at fungicide, we can look at population, we can look at fertility, even along the base. If you look at what everybody did, this is where it comes in fun. This was me, I screwed up. I'll just tell you flat out. I wanted to mess around and say, let's go dark horse. Because of the location, I had a little, I've been farming out there for a bit, and every now and then Double Stop would just throw up crazy numbers like, let's go for it. And then it got delayed, and basically by the time we planted, I knew it, I'd done did bad. But we ran Double Stop at 1 million, Cruiser Max, 50 pounds pre of MAP. We did 120 pounds of in on March 4th. These are the dates of application. We did a generic TEB and then Top Guard with 2 gallons UAN on March 19th. April 19th. So 2-shot, dumped a little UAN in. Total cost of our operation for that was $106 an acre, $107. You had the West, OCWES West. We have Showdown at 1 million with Cruiser Max, pre of 100 MAP. They did 75 pounds plus an MBPT with 20K and March 4th, 22 in, April 1st, generic Teb, my crop, and a cost of 176. And by the way, I was getting all the prices. I called co-ops. I think, Cody, you gave me some of these prices. This was prices at the time. Every time we bought fertilizer, I went to the Two Rivers website and pulled down their fertilizer quote. So that's just up the road from where we're doing this. $176. The East Group, WB 4422, 120 pounds of seed. And we didn't tell them how to tell seed. It could be by pound or it could be by seed count. 300 pounds of MAP, 60 pounds in on March, Teb, generic, and they're at $93. We got the Wheat Commission, Showdown, 1.2 mil, Cruiser Max, 60 pounds MAP, 50 in, 40 in. I am enjoying that even in the people doing this, I don't know if you know, there wasn't a whole lot of pre-plant, so it's almost like somebody listened to me at some point in the last 10 years. Ran my crop, none of that generic, and really our spring wasn't horribly wet. So that generic Teb, even on our side, was almost just a preventative, just in case kind of thing. My crop on March, $150. We go to Oklahoma Wheat Growers. They ran Smith's Gold at 160. They did 60 pounds of in March, and they still did my crop. That's because they had Showdown. There wasn't a dang seed of Smith's Gold left when it came springtime. It had 100% winter kill for some reason. Germination. Thank you, Josh. We didn't get any germ on that, and so they ran kind of light because all they had was the Showdown comparative, counted themselves out. Kissling ran high cotton, Cruiser they ran 100 pounds MAP and K, and then they ran nitrogen and sulfur, and then nitrogen cover XL, $180. Rendell tried his 4401, something he would play with in the Northeast. Pretty common. That's what he would run. 44 pounds of DAP, a little bit of in there. So he still went nitrogen early, a little bit, 50 in. Top Guard, EQ Top Guard, 147. And then Kansas had to be Kansas. So they had to roll Providence, which wasn't as bad, but they had to grow. And they added Cruiser Max, which we had, but we had to find this Cruiser 5FS. That wasn't just something we had. And then they had to have Mez, so they had to go special on that. So Kansas did Kansas and went special. And they spent $165. There's what I think is interesting, just that input cost graph, right? So we're running the OGA, Keith Felty was the one running that one. So if you know Keith, you know he's going to be low input. So that fits right in with the Felty farm plans. We're sub 75, and you have Kissling is right up there tickling with the West. So Bashong and Kissling, these kind of Northwest guys like to spend their money. Average about 140. What we learned from the base management. In the planting, we planted late, wet, and very cold, and we had about a 4 bushel bump with 125 million over the 0.87 million. We also had just fungicide versus no fungicide, solid 4 bushel bump. So that's a yes or no. It's like it had nothing or it had something, and had a 4 bushel bump. We look at the variety testings. We had about a 50-pound range. You could lose up to 50 bushel per acre if you chose the wrong variety or one that doesn't germinate. Right? There's where we're at. Everybody else was usually, the variety could be a plus or minus 10 bushel. Right? That's the kind of swings that we'd get with the winter loss. And so, I had the one that I chose was a 10 bushel loss. We look at our yields. Blue is the chosen, the wheat improvement team. This is my double stop that let me down. The West, you guys had Showdown, I think, Bashong, right? You guys ran Showdown, so that's that. But all the orange is Showdown. So blue is exactly what was asked for. The orange is that comparative that everybody's at Showdown, right? You kind of see that. You kind of see how some of the management does flex. And so we're around 65 bushel on the upper end as you look at some of the yields as far as the Showdown. And then you see, right there, but even that management, because Felty basically gave up at the end anyways, and so you see that drop down. If we look at our top yields, we had from the team what was chosen, You had Bashong with Showdown. And this is kind of nice as far as what I'm doing, because these were the same varieties so it said the width Showdown and the Showdown. It's almost a duplicate. So the two treatments were identical, and they're only about 2 bushels separate. So that was telling me that we've actually got a fairly consistent yield where we needed to. Kisling's pulled 62 bushel and Kansas got 61 bushel. So everybody's in there about 64, 61. If you look at it versus the standard where everybody's at Showdown, now you got Kisling at 64, Wheat Improvement 64, and the East at 64. None of those are significant. I couldn't parse out 1 bushel to save my life, but everybody's in that top realm in there. Seeing that the one thing that the commission, pardon me, was a little bit lower, KSU was a little bit lower. So you have some of those that ended up getting dinged a little bit. Profitability, quickly, we got our East group. I want to go back. Let's remember something, huh? This right here, huh? You thought it was 40 pounds or 40 tons? So, fair enough. So anyways, Pew, you and your boys pulled the best profitability, partially because the yields didn't differ that much and you spent the least amount of money, right? So, huh? Never yielding yield potential. Wheat Improvement in the West are there. And this is all difference in us spending less and making less, West spending more and making more. Profitability is about the same, even though there's about an 8 bushel difference or 9 bushel difference, just management wise. If you look at the standard, again, the East one with profitability, you cheap turds. Wheat Improvement teams at 290 and the wheat growers at 250. Remember the wheat growers, the ones that spent almost nothing and yielded nothing off their own, did really good when it came to profit because they've spent very little. Shockingly, wheat can grow 50 bushel without trying very hard if you're in an okay environment. Moving through, analyzing the data, there's a whole lot of data looking at this. Looking at all the 22 variables, the miller gave me 22 variables. I looked at 11 that Carver said was important. Variety and management both were significant influence on milling data. So it was the management and variety both impacted milling. That was shown. We look at the best millers, the West stands out. The wheat makers, Josh Bashong and the group, milled the best. Wheat Improvement team was second, was KSU coming in third. Purple can't do better. We got to keep purple down a little bit. No, this is me right here. That's me there, Bubba. We're still over purple. We're not talking football. All right. Yeah. And so a lot of this was varietal. The variety selection did play in quite a bit with on this milling side, but this is all the same Showdown. So this is all Showdown. And this showed where some of the management did influence that milling quality. And the top 3, they couldn't really be sorted, but you drop below 3 and we started really sorting out some management strategies. Nothing that I could just say this was the absolute thing because everybody had tweaked a little thing. So I can't just zoom in and say this is what did it. It's kind of the systems, I would say, more of the approach that did the wins. So our winners, these are the ones that we made. We got the Bin Busters, the West. West group got it. Our money bags, the East group. The best baked is the West. All right, so Josh, 2 for 3. Well done, sir. Honorable CCA, because the agronomics and just overall on what they did on the standard, the team Keith Kisling on the yield wise and overall on the standard did the best. This is what we have this year. OGA came in a little bit too late. The seed was being dropped as we were getting the Wheat Growers Association's recommendations, so it was a little bit late. But this is what we've got. So everything's at Showdown. We've got the Wheat Improvement team is 41.7C. This is silver. I don't know what that is. Noob. And we don't tell the other teams what they've got, right? So we're not telling who does what. And so both Bashong and Pew Boyd Improvement Team. I honestly also got this list as the seed was being dropped in the ground, so I didn't know what they did. It's being released. Okay. The East and the West both chose 44-22. So that's you guys talking across each other, or? Okay. Wheat Commission, Butler's Gold. We got Kissling Showdown, Rendell's Butler's Gold, and K-State's back at Providence. We see everybody's a little bit higher. We did just go in at the end of the month, end of November. Everybody's running that 1 to 1.25 million seed. K-State did go 1.4. A lot of Cruiser Max, no treatment as far as the East, no treatment as far as Kissling, with the Cruiser Max Vibrance for Rendell and K-State. It's in the ground. It's at Perkins. So last year was our LCB location. It was a no-till wheat. This year it's at Perkins. We call it the pumpkin patch. It's a little patch that just somehow always, if there's rain, does quite well. It was a wheat stubble that we put soybeans in. Soybeans got up to hip high and we roller crimped it down. And so come in over the top with that really good deep soil. So it should be a lot of fun to see how this goes. And we'll be doing more updates on social media, just share the teams and try to get a better job of getting out and about. Any questions on TAPS or anything other than TAPS? Huh? None of them graze. When we're ready to start driving down once a week to Kinder Farms to do some grazing, we might try it. But we need industry support if we're doing that one. No management strategy, not last year. The fungicide, everybody's basically in on the fungicide. The fungicide, making sure, and last year we got hit late, and so having some of that stuff on, we did have that, we had stripe rust run through late, and everybody was pretty timely with that. And I think that, as far as an overall management, probably did, but not one thing. And these aren't made to say that this is the win. This is honestly made so that Josh can play with. This should be a playground for people to do things they wouldn't normally do on their own farm. So that's the whole point of it, is to take some risk on this and mess around a little bit on these. And so I mean, I've been looking at TAPS data for 10 years now. It's because everything's changing. Nothing's repeated and consistent. It's hard to really just poke a hole in one thing. Yeah, Mike? Northeast. He is Miami and is about as close as you get to Kansas, Baxter Springs. Just think, I was about to say Chat Piles and other things, but just think Chat Piles and that's Brent. Or Lead, one of the two. Huh? Oh, that's K-State. No, these are all in Stillwater. Every plot is here. We're managing them all here. That's the deal. It's like we have Manhattan scientists, we've got Northeast Oklahoma, we got Western, Northwest, we have Southwest when we bring on Felty and stuff. So we've got like this spattering of wheat production regions and in one location. If we get better, we could go further places. But if we're out there once a week scouting and giving reports, and I got, like when it came to fungicides, I got 5 different fungicides coming at me on the same week at all different rates and all different things. And to get in multiple locations is not the easiest on this one. All right. And the one, not just because it's Dr. Lofton, but the one talk you all have been waiting for is Dr. Joshua Lofton.
But I got show and tell.
You do have show and tell. I'll help you carry out the show and tell. If somebody's going to dance, it's going to be Lofton.
Oh. Me and Raiden got something for y'all when we finish. He said he didn't do an interpretive dance, but him and me are going to tag team one. Check your version on that. Only you would have to do that. Okay. Where's the, oh, there it is. Okay, so realistically, the reason why I wanted to go after Brian is because I didn't listen to much of what he said when he told me what to do, and I didn't want him to be able to comment on it whenever I got done. So, yeah, and you can kind of see here is that originally he had asked me, we had started doing some oat work, and so he had kind of asked me to highlight some of that work. When I started kind of parsing through it, and I really didn't have enough to really do any groundbreaking comments here today. So what I did is I wanted to throw in a couple of extra stuff and really just look at some of the nitrogen management we've been doing on annual forage systems. Okay, so we're gonna cover two things. We are gonna cover those oats, but we're also gonna touch into some forage sorghum as well to kind of get us rolling. But we are going to start with the oats, and I will highlight that I often say when we do this project that we're doing spring oats, and people get confused. Oh, you're planting spring oats, or what are you doing? So I did change it to spring planted oats. Okay, so we're not looking particularly at spring oats. I talked to Brian a little bit about that yesterday. Maybe something we can evaluate in the future, but we are talking about spring planted oats. So who here has ever done the spring planted oat system? Who here likes the spring planted oat system? Okay, so the first question is why oats? And when we go to national meetings and when we go kind of outside this Southern Great Plains area, a lot of people ask us, well, why is oats the small grain that you selected? Okay, and that's kind of what we have is this visual representation here. Okay, and so when we take a look at biomass accumulation and that representing forage accumulation and how fast we can put that on, the different small grains put on forage and put on biomass very differently, much differently than each other. Okay, so obviously this first one, what is this? The fact that all of you didn't yell and there's little seed heads out here means I know you guys are tired. Okay. So yeah, so we got oats over there. Okay. So the big thing about the oats is really quick growing, really rapid growing. But what they're doing is they're going to focus on that single stem. Good leaf material, single stem, not really focused on that tiller production. So we're going to put a lot of biomass into that main stem and accumulate it really quickly. What do we think this is? It is a grass. That is correct. That one's barley. So if you ever take a look at kind of those growth accumulations, the next one that really puts on a lot of really early rapid growth is going to be barley. And it's one that, again, it's perking up a little bit. We see that we are starting to put on a little bit of that elongation of the stem. If you come in through here and you see that while those seed heads are out, those barley are putting on and moving through that production season really rapidly. What is this next one? What do we think? Who says trip? Who says rye? Who says wheat? This is rye. Okay, so that's going to be your rye, which leaves our last one to be what? That's our wheat. Okay, so we see wheat really focusing on putting all of those tiller production, really focused on tillering, getting that good ground cover to it. And all of these were planted not the same day, but very close proximity, right about the middle of September. So this is what they look between the middle of September and now. They were in a greenhouse, so they have been protected, but they have the same conditions. So this is kind of what you would expect, the different growth of the different small grains in this kind of this 2.5, 3 month period leading up to the winter crop school here today. And that kind of is shown here, these pictures. These pictures are from our field trials that we've had in the last couple of years. This first picture is actually right, I think it's about a week to 10 days after our last planting, there in about mid-March. The next picture is the same. I'm kind of standing in the same spot. That is not but 29 days later. Okay, so when we're talking about the rapid development of vegetation on oats, we're really talking about very rapid development, putting on a lot of vegetation, a lot of biomass in a very short amount of time. So that's kind of why we're focused on those oats and that spring planting, especially this year. I've gotten a lot of growers, because oats are kind of in short supply, on saying, hey, can I go out with rye or barley, or what about just throwing wheat? So remember this, whenever you're talking to growers and it comes that time to plant, remember this representation of what you're potentially going to get in that 2 to 3 month period that we have between planting and when it gets a little too hot for our small grains to continue to put on forage. Okay, so really, really focused on oats. Oats is that best one that we can have in that system. And if you want to see Trit, I didn't want to grab 5, but Trit's out in the hall if you want to see how triticale does in that same amount of time. Okay, so oats, this is the reason why we're looking at oats. So again, when we're talking about spring oats, we are talking about spring planted oats. This is still a winter oat variety that we're evaluating. Basically, I go to Seedman every year and I say, Seedman, what do you have oat-wise that I can buy? And he tells me what I have, and that's what I do. So I go to Seed, and there's Trip. So we just go like everybody else, go to Foundation Seed, looking at what oat variety we can, and we are growing that. So we're growing the same oats that everybody else would have access and would be able to grow. And for all intents and purposes today for oats, we're talking about hay. So we're talking about end of season 1 cutting of oats at the end of the year. So I know I talked to Raiden quite a bit when we're starting to put these things together, and you know, his family grazes, something we're going to look into the future. But for this intents and purposes, we're talking about a hay system to where we go through, cut that one time, get all that oat hay up, and then move on into a summer crop. And this is just the start of this process. Realistically, I started looking at oats as a cover crop. And when we were doing biomass accumulations, I really had, if we're pulling off soybeans in October, pulling off soybeans or cotton in November, I really can't go in for a cover crop in October and November and get a lot of coverage. So my thought was, I need to find a cover crop to tell growers to plant in the spring that can get enough biomass that we can replant a summer crop into. When we started getting into the biomass, actually, Brian Vincent at this meeting said, why don't you start looking more into the forage aspect of these oats and less into the cover crop aspects? And that's kind of where this is. So we are kind of just on the start of this. And so that's kind of what Brian wanted to do, is introduce some of this work we've been doing and give you guys the opportunity to kind of peek behind that curtain a little early in the process. So if there's anything you guys are seeing, especially you folks that are growing this system or working with growers, come let us know what you want to see. Okay, so when we really started looking into it, everybody told me plant it on Valentine's Day. Brian Vincent, I do believe, specifically told me take your wife out to dinner the night before and then go plant your oats. What if it's dry? Plant your oats. What if it's wet? Plant your oats. You just plant them. So, I mean, the biggest thing is how late could you plant them? And you kind of look around and everybody says, plant them by March. Okay, well, show me the data of why I plant them by March. I don't know, I don't have it, but just plant them by March. So we wanted to see kind of when that last date was, and if we did plant them late, how much fall off do we have in biomass? Especially as we start getting into these weird springs, to where some springs we stay cold all the way through the middle of May. Some springs we're heating up by the middle of April. Okay, so we wanted to get a kind of a deep dive of several of these springs to see how much this biomass kind of started to fall off. And then the big question is, do I need nitrogen? I work with a lot of folks that kind of use some of these summer or some of these annual, what you would maybe consider crops in other parts of the world, and treat them like a forage. Sometimes we just remove the fertility and just get what we get and be very low income. Maybe Keith is on that same one. And some of them really want to put the inputs to it. So do we need nitrogen? How much do we need? And are we impacting quality at that point in time? Okay, so that's kind of what we went with. We have 2 years of data right now. Overall, the trial, it's actually Josie Rice's trial. She's my PhD student back there. This is part of her dissertation. But we planted oats successively in 4 weeks. So we started out Valentine's Day, and that was a Monday in 2023, and we just planted it every Monday successively for 4 weeks. We did that with 0 pounds of N and then with 50 pounds of N. We put the N down right when we planted it. Okay. So it didn't matter if it was, I took the Brian Vincent approach. As long as we could get a drill in the ground, we planted it. If it was dry, we planted it. If it was perfect, we still planted it. So just every Monday, we just planted it for a month. So this is kind of the shape that we see on these two. So we got oat forage dry weight over here. So very, very typically of what you would see in the literature, especially Brian, I know we were talking, and Brian, you know, east side of the state, you guys get so much forage over there. They can produce some grain over there, I guess, too. But he was telling me forage yields, and I was kind of looking through it last night, and I kind of got a little bit better because it looks like western side of the state, about 2,000 pounds, kind of what you would expect. And so without any nitrogen in 2023, we got about 2,000 pounds. It was actually our highest yielding right there, right at Valentine's Day. Okay. From there, we kind of fell off on biomass every week that we missed. So if we waited for those right conditions and we kind of waited 2 weeks, we fell off by about, 200, 250 pounds of biomass until we got to week 4, which was our lowest biomass. Where we put nitrogen, especially in 2023, we didn't gain any biomass. But what we did gain was flexibility. Because you guys can see from those yields, we really didn't change. So we went from the 14th of February onto the last part of February, onto the first part of March, and we still got, relatively speaking, the same yield. It was a little bit lower than the really timely one over here, but it was kind of all significantly not different. And this is kind of what we see from the percent biomass reduction we have from waiting each successive week after that 14th, that Valentine's Day headline that everybody talks about. So in where we put nitrogen out, relatively no difference here. However, where we didn't put, we lost about 5% of forage biomass. Then it dropped to 16, and then we're losing 25 additional, and these are additional percent. So we're continuing to lose as we go down. That flexibility made it to where we could plant all the way through that first part of March. We still fell off by the middle of March, and we still lost that biomass. Just didn't have enough time to allow that biomass before the heat of May kind of came in and really reduced the amount of biomass we could accumulate. So adding that nitrogen, we didn't get the yield here, but what it did add is that flexibility to the system. We could wait for some good conditions on through February. Did the same thing this next year. This is when we actually saw benefit of nitrogen. We got a bump in our biomass production and our yields where we added nitrogen, but the same story kind of came true here. Where we didn't add nitrogen, we had our highest yields right at that February 14th. If we went in that mid-February, we had our best yields. We reduced kind of periodically until the lowest one being that mid-March being our lowest yields where we didn't add nitrogen. Same thing with the fertilize, except it was higher total yields as well, to where we really maintained yield and had that flexibility of planting when environment allowed us to plant. And then again, by the time mid-March, even this year where the fertilizer was good, and we see the tonnage is much better. We had over 3,000 pounds where we fertilized with it. Still that back end of March, we are falling off quite a bit. So kind of does seem like that first part of March is our threshold to where we need to think about transitioning to something else. So if we're light on forage, maybe we're transitioning now to a millet, to a forage sorghum, something else, because our oats really are primed. That's first part of February on in through the first part of March is kind of where we're looking. Again, we wanted to look at quality as well. So this is in 2024. So this is protein. Overall, the planting date and associated maturity kind of had a bigger role to play on this than nitrogen did. And when we go into the sorghum, you'll kind of see very similar aspect to where the nitrogen fertility, putting 50 extra pounds of nitrogen really didn't gain a whole lot on the quality perspective. And we said, there's a lot of folks that will say, well, that's a maturity factor. It's 4 weeks different planting date, right? Who here's planted anything in the spring, several weeks apart? Does 4 weeks in February make 4 weeks in May? No. The difference here between our first week was at heading, so we probably were right at about here, where the last one was really in the boot where those heads were just about to pop out. So we were maybe 7 days apart between our first week and our fourth week by the time we got to harvest. So looking at that booting to early heading stage to optimize both that biomass and the quality is kind of where we all are hitting on each of these. There is a little bit of a benefit by delaying, really not a nitrogen benefit for the protein aspect. ADF, very similar. We had the benefit from just going a little bit later, having a little bit more succulent biomass to that. TDN follows generally that same trend. So our fertility to it didn't matter as much as our planting date did, but our planting date, even some benefit of the quality we are getting is probably overcome by the fact that we're losing a lot of good amount of that biomass when we wait and delay planting to that back end. So quality wasn't really impacted. I think the biggest thing for me, quality-wise, this shows is how good quality hay these oats can be when we get out there and harvest them on time. And I really think that this graph kind of shows that, because even the difference between right at boot, which is where this week 4 was when we harvested it, to actual head or panicle emergence, we dropped, 4% protein, just like that. So within a week of itself, we're dropping really, really rapidly. Now, I don't think, Brian, you'd ever complain about 16% pro in 3,000 pounds of forage, but when you had the opportunity to get 21%, maybe you would, okay? The other thing, and Ashley, I think you said it correctly. I cautioned whether I wanted to talk about this today. And the big thing that we get asked a lot from producers outside the state of Oklahoma is herbicide management. And a lot of growers from like Kansas and all them, when they're growing, as well as some of the folks that I've talked to in the northern states, are really starting to reevaluate into these spring planted oat systems. And I will tell you that this is kind of a row of herbicides that I kind of talked to some folks up north about. None of these are labeled. Not for at least the time to where we put it out. Okay, so you got to be really cautious and read your labels, because none of these are really going to be that none of these are going to be within the realm of something that you should recommend to a grower quite yet, okay? And then the other thing, I'm talking to Raiden again, asking, well, what if I have problem with grass? If you have problem with ryegrass or bromes, would you put out an herbicide, a pre, when you're planting oats for hay? No. So what we were kind of targeting is this field had an issue with henbit, cutleaf evening primrose, and mustards. And that's kind of what we were trying to aim for to get rid of here. So we had a check. This was planted that first part of March. So we had a check. We had Prowl H2O, Finesse, Zidua, and Anthem Flex is kind of what we put out. This is kind of what they're evaluating up in Minnesota, up in Wisconsin, up in New York for their spring planted oat system. And so the individual numbers, those singular numbers, are the weed control rating that we had, being 1 is the worst and 10 is the best. And then the number in parentheses is how much yield over the check that herbicide did get. So if we do have an issue with broadleafs into these oat systems and we are getting enough yield to make this an economic option, there are some like Zidua that have some benefit to them. I'm a little surprised the Anthem Flex was that much lower than the Zidua. The Finesse, I will tell you, the big issue with the Finesse would be what? When we planted it on these oats, when we put it on oats. It's big crop injury. We did a lot of good weed control early, but when we evaluated it at harvest, we had a lot of weeds because we didn't have a whole lot of oats. Okay, so we had big crop injury with the Finesse. We had decent control here with the Zidua, and I will say that all of these Anthem Flex, Finesse, and Prowl were all applied pre. The Zidua was applied a delayed pre, so at spiking is when we applied that Zidua. Yeah, and that's the other thing is that we're kind of like Brian was with the taps. We kind of went in and we talked to the folks up north and said, "What are you guys looking at? This is what we have available. So let's go out with it on what we will." And I kind of looked at all of these on how comfortable a traditional wheat farmer might be on applying some of these and kind of went with it. So there is some options maybe in the future. Again, can't recommend any of these because most of these are off label. And that's why I didn't put my rates out because it's off label. So you guys don't get to know the rates because I'm not recommending. Brian, you hear, I said, I'm not recommending this. Not recommending, but it's something we are looking at for the future if we do have some issues with some broadleafs in field that could be yield limiting or forage limiting in these systems. Okay, so spring planted oats. Really, you don't lose anything by going with that traditional that Valentine's Day planting. That probably should be where we still try to shoot. Why not, you go back to 2024, why not that March 1st? Because that was higher yielding. Well, if you miss that window, you remember what happened in the middle of March. It was all downhill from there. Okay, so we want to try to still focus on this mid-February. If you're going to put out some fertilizer, or if you do get delayed because it's too wet, it's too dry, you want to wait for it, even if you didn't want to add that fertilizer from a yield perspective, you probably need to start adding in that fertilizer to just kind of safeguard that longevity of that planting window. It does open up to early March with nitrogen, but don't expect a significant quality boost with that. Okay, we haven't kind of seen it over several years of looking at it. And so we probably won't consistently see it. You might see it from year to year, but maybe not consistently. And we still recommend, and I get a lot of growers that say that oats produce too loose of a bale and they don't like it. The rodents get into it. And I think timely harvest and timely management's you're really telltale to that. Make sure you're getting out there before they're in any grain, because I haven't seen more mice run out of a bale of hay than a soft dough oat bale. And you're really going to wind in some big issues there. So really want to be around booting to flour. Not only is that best blend of biomass and that quality, but it also just produces a better hay for the system. In the future, we are looking to look at some grazing and recovery on this, to go out and look on how frequently we can graze that and bring cattle into that system. Brian talks all on the east, in-furrow P, Radin and his family did. So looking at how in-furrow P match that. And forage accumulation, I always look at these, and the one small grain I never see is oats on these things. And so how much biomass are we accumulating each week? That way, if we are looking to graze it and we are looking to predict how many weeks after planting we can maybe kick cattle out onto it, we have that answer and we have a little bit of information on that. So that's oats. Any question on oats?
Like for graze out, we guy that gets late in the fall and can't plant, we not fall grazing, would there be benefit to waiting to just plant oats?
Well, and I think that's what me and Brian talked a lot this year. We kind of, on some parts of Oklahoma, kind of missed that forage season. So if you are a more forage focused individual, and I think that's why we're going to be pretty thin on oats this year, is I think a lot of cattlemen that traditionally would want to either graze out or lean more towards the heavy side of grazing on a dual purpose system, maybe missed that window and have already started booking those oats for the spring. I think a year like this year, where we kind of missed that September planting of wheat, is a good year to maybe think about those oats coming in the spring.
The OK oats are winter oats as well. You could plant them.
Yeah, and that's the other thing I talked to Brian, is he said there's a lot of folks that go ahead and plant it in the fall, graze that or hay that, and maybe go back in the spring and plant it too. So get a good amount of forage there with 2 bursts of good quality forage. Okay, so I don't want to, Seeding rate, we went for 60 pounds the acre. Okay, so we, and I talked to Brian. He said that he's seen some just as good yields going down to 30, but I've heard some folks go, you need 75. So kind of right around that 2 bushel perspective. Yep. Okay, so talking about forage sorghum systems, one thing I just kind of wanted to introduce. So this year we had our annual forage evaluation of got in some varieties in that some of our companies wanted to see how well they perform here. We do a once every 3 year, we do a similar thing that Jordan Bell does in Lubbock, looking at how well our forage sorghums do, and we usually accept 1 to maybe 2 per company. The interesting thing is 2 companies actually wanted hybrids to be tested this year, but they all were sorghum partners. So we all got sorghum partners. So sorghum partners across the board here. So we looked at the SP 2707, the SS 405, NK 300, and the SP 2606 this year. Again, we did this. I get a lot of questions from growers and from the companies on saying, well, it seems like a lot of Oklahoma growers maybe bin run some sorghum and just put it out there and just kind of let it go. Don't put a whole lot of inputs, where when we talk to the folks in Texas, they're more, certified seed, going to put out a good amount of fertilizer to it to get a little bit of extra biomass. So we wanted to see how much we physically gain and if that is variety dependent. And so we did an evaluation this year. This is a chopped system. So we were at about 50 to 52% moisture, a single cutting system to where we went through and wet chopped that. And that's kind of the system that we were looking at. Okay, I have some data on the back end of this for a hayed system, but this is a chopped system. So this is that one singular harvest. We planted this, I do believe the second week of July. Is that right? Second week of July is when we planted this. Basically, July 4th, and the next time we get rain, we're going to throw it in the ground. Okay, so again, we were pretty responsive, gained about 1.5 tons with the SP 2707. Didn't really gain a whole lot of benefit with the 405. The NK also very responsive, about 1.5 tons. And the SP 206 was also very responsive. This is actually their response. The deltas between the unfertilized and fertilized, if it has an asterisk, it's significant. So we did find a significant increase in our biomass accumulation, our forage yields. For 3 of them, the SS 205, only about 1/3 of a ton higher with nitrogen, really didn't parse out significantly, had a little bit of variability with that. So overall, we had a good boost, about 1.5 tons, like I said, with a little extra, again, 50 pounds of fertilizer right at planting is what we did. Had a good boost in the biomass right with that fertilizer. Again, wanted to look at the quality. Protein increased about 0.3%. On average, we were at about 8% total pro across the board, and so we really didn't move that needle all that much. The difference between the fertilized, unfertilized, when we fertilized, we decreased ADF by about 4.5%, but they were all under 40. They were about 36 pretty much across the board. And then our TDN that should be increased by 2.8, but again, it was all over 60%. So again, didn't really move the needle all that much on quality. Quality was very varietal dependent. And so then you have to start asking yourself, how valuable is that 50 pounds of nitrogen to that system? I don't know. I think you really have to pencil it out, that 1.5 tons, on how much you can get for an extra 1.5 tons of material, even with the quality being pretty static. So this is when we looked at it as a hay. This is actually one of Dr. Phillips' students that I was on a committee for, looked at forage sorghum, BMR sorghum as a hay, looking at fertilizer. So we have a little bit more detailed of a fertilizer evaluation here. So we go up, and I do apologize, kilograms per hectare, but basically looking at 50, 100, 150, 200 pounds, and then looked at them on a split system to where they hayed it twice. So where that split put that extra bit of nitrogen right after that haying to get that regrowth going, and see how that helped us here. So looking at first harvest, second harvest, you can see those values. But if you kind of look at total yield, no nitrogen, we were able to harvest about 8 megagrams per hectare. So, and then we increased substantially just putting a little bit of fertilizer out there on that hay system. And where we really got it is in both systems, both harvests, both that early harvest and that regrowth harvest, increasing it by quite a bit, 18. Once you got over about that 50 pounds of N, everything kind of increased, but much more modestly. Just getting enough out there to get that growth, get it up and get growing is really what we added. We still had a pretty decent jump here to where we went all the way up to 224 or 200 pounds to the acre. So we did gain, approximately 8 tons by going up to 200 pounds from 50. The real value is that split and allowing and putting that extra fertilizer once we go through that hay and getting that nitrogen available for that regrowth, and allowing that regrowth to have a little bit of nutrients underneath it, because we really shot up with the total amount of harvest, especially on that second harvest. So that late season, that late summer harvest is where we're really collecting a lot more of the biomass by having that split. Of course, when you have that split, you give it a good shot of nitrogen there. You're going to see some benefit to it. So if you are willing to go out and put a little extra fertilizer to it, that splitting it between your two, right at planting and then right after your first harvest, is kind of your best way to go it. When we look at total N uptake, we see that the N uptake was definitely very pronounced based on how much nitrogen we took up. Really wasn't a difference. We really didn't get increased uptake with that split compared to just that one single upfront application. There was a little bit of extra, but nothing parsed out as significant there. Again, looking at quality, didn't really move the needle on it. Even our nitrates, so even putting 200 pounds of N on that sorghum, that BMR sorghum, even at that single application all up front, really didn't hurt us on our nitrate. Was overall just a very low nitrate year. This was 2021, so this was not outside of the drought. So that first year of those dry conditions we had really didn't move the needle on protein or any of our quality ADF TDN. So again, where we're getting the value of that fertilizer is on that biomass, accumulating more and more of that biomass. So really have to pencil out that biomass on, see if it's of value to these fertilizer applications. So with that, I'm done. I'll readdress the red dirt agronomy. Readdress the red dirt agronomy podcast that me and Brian put on. Well, and you, Dave, but we talk and Dave makes it look amazing. There you go. Is that good? Okay. I almost got in trouble with that one. And then another program that me and Dave did this year was Red Dirt Soy. So this is funded by the Oklahoma Soybean Board. So we actually took a look. Dave actually did this. I didn't have any work. I didn't do any of this work, Dave. You did all of it. But he went out every week and we did a 360 view of a soybean field here in Oklahoma. So you can see, even in these really droughty conditions, how a soybean plant looks as it grows right here outside of Stillwater. In addition, we highlighted some of the work that we've done on soybean across the state. It's really hard to grab all the soybean producers for one centralized field day like we can have at like Lahoma with our wheat. And so we kind of did some videos across the state on what we're doing on soybean production as well. So Go check out that red dirt soy for those videos. On the oats were basically non-existent, and then the sorghum one, we actually looked at it a little bit. We didn't move the needle on the concentration. The ones on our forage sorghum were a little high, but the fertilizer didn't have a significant impact on it.